So making a record, there's a lot of things I'm going to try and say, and a lot of things I'm going to try and not say. It's a bit of a question forever. There's so many things we can keep track of, and it's hard to explain the things that you don't. For instance, experience sensation and connection. There's all the places you can look and see it and remember it and care about it or not care about it. Till you never change your boot. And the experience or the sensation or the connection is no longer something that don'ts are working for you in conversation, in memory, in tangible, in the definable, and this makes what? This makes sensation, this makes memory, this makes uniformity of synapse, a fading desire. That's what it makes. Uniformity of synapse, a fading desire. What is maybe unanswered? Where and how kept unanswered, where, by whom, maybe when. Synapse is exposure protected of the euphoria of sensing you're not holding what? Sensing connectivity that isn't remaining intangible by itself. Anybody defines a for another, for connection, for goals, where the fading is what? And demonstration is as key as is ending. Collectivity in ending. it's clear the forces that define the fading, and the forces that define A, and the forces that know or sense of what are clearly different than each and every force that defines the collectivity at an end. And any way you describe or define either of them is maybe a false relationship to sentiment of things that fade in all time. So the relationship demonstrable of the variable differences is a what of itself with an entropy at synapse. But the demonstration of sensation, or the demonstration of relation, or the demonstration of meaning in or near to what, is embraced by a trace of expecting and expectancies with precisely without growth, without step, without what sensation has connections, has entropy, has continuation or survival in proportionate pressures that aren't in totality. You might say an aspect of survival pressure that is the age in part of synapse collectivity beneath such a precisely. Maybe consistently attempting to grave dig, to root out all synapse of every barrier that measures that. Meanwhile, you might find that generally feeling or knowing or holding explicit design or explicit sensuality to any number of connections of these concepts to approach maybe never simply straightforward or never simply holdable, and the reality that these concepts are seen or apathied simply held by what or whom or things, simply held by possibility that the content or the subjects are stirred or glimpsed And the normalcy of not changing a boot is maybe learned about in proportion to such concepts. And sciencing is a grave digging at a proportion not existing with or not seeing some of these facets of continuosity or survival collectivity at near synapse. So it becomes difficult for anybody to describe or define necessity or goals. Why focus of such connections has a use, has a blood, has a replenishing, where the concepts maybe forever depend on a spirit sort of their own, and yet you'd have to spend forever trying to figure out ahead of time how to place support or safety of the existence of the concepts in a realm. Of all the maths that can be measured at a pressure, at proportions to things and transfers, there's maybe one reason why totality of collectivity will maybe consistently fail to produce the necessary supports of maybe many aspects of life, or of learning, or of environmental creational opportunity. Now, the normalcy that an environment carries or holds entropy or stability. It's clear that very few forces would attempt to define an environment holding stability at a utility in proportion to many of these concepts. And maybe there's the synapse, maybe there's the math of forearm existing or not existing, intellectually or non-intellectually, either at the pressure or at the potential or at the measure absorption of such configurative, either of language or of sound or of visual inspections, structural entropy, frames of broadcast, and data collectivity in sorts. Teetering on the usage of these pressure, you might say, abnormalities, the why any sifting mechanism might carry processing sophistication that is attributed to types of thinkers, types of developers, types of designers, types of existing forces. And you maybe hit the sharpest point of what in proportion to loading mechanism. You load a telemetry, or you load a functional organizer. Some of the engines of these devices, systems, processes, collectivities. The engines aren't potentially felt in synapse utility in proportion to the principle of why these engines would be constructed in proportion to these types of concepts in any system. And so the engines are, you might say, tendency, likeness, fissured into process, maybe based on highly sophisticated processing encoding that maybe doesn't have a historical fix, maybe doesn't have a relationship to any particular survivor, or any particular cause, or any particular endeavor to frame environments, or any particular endeavor to create normative. Not the sense of normation, but to create normative. And so it's clear that if and when there are you might say manageable engine relationships of abstract or abnormal bound synapse processing, the implication is not only on the environment or the existing states or the totaling of drawdowns of learning spontaneity or learning expanse pressures, but there's also implication more directly on normative, bound, configurative, or dependency. And so you have the obviousness of how critical such a creatorial echelon of focus is, maybe in proportion to convoluted convincing at helms of normative bound. So, definition of cleansing normative bound operation in proportion to limits of who can tangibly direct or touch or configure or with applied resource availability render totalings at a survival advantage as opposed to a disadvantage in survival. These cleansings of maybe information or bound of mentality in operatives or in logics connectivities, frames of either incoming or outgoing focus are definitely of critical forever bound relationships, where the abstracts are major time costers in systemic learning, likely without a logic base or a synapse relationship happening at those types of peripheries to the engagement realities. Basically, holding information to operate on a normative bound or visit a normative bound relationship and learn about it or see it or hold it. Any reason there'd be a convoluted connection to those learnings at a distance from the designer or the design or the finality of the normative. Okay? Each of these pressure relationships are near to finalities where any number of forces aren't going to be expected to care about those finalities, as opposed to the transfer at ulterior engineering of information. Okay? And so, over time spent seeing in these flows of what can be touched, what doesn't need to be touched, definition of not only the types of forces or steps of forces to know or communicate or design or expose, teach. All the operations ideally would be defined in proportion to a normative, in proportion to constrictive limit of databasing, maybe at all scales of survival, where involvement pressures or attempts to convolute the definitions would be determined. See, determining those definitions are clean is almost more important than any age of anybody adapting a skill or acquiring new vision or becoming something that they haven't been before. Those types of definitions are right in line with the finality of the cleanliness of those frames of pressure. Because what, in its what sense, the what you can't easily hide a configurative intelligence, scalar and pressure finder. Can't easily hide one of these things in proportion to certain types of knowns. You can't easily rectify the vantage of certain types of knowns in proportion to cleanliness at normative pressure utilities, and the meaning of sentimentizing with this is a forever shepherdship. The meaning of reducing available access to the conceptual positioning is a forever shepherdship. And that's everybody's limit. And almost all of them aren't defining it or ensuring it or forcing finality of it all the time. All the time. These types of truths define, just as the concepts literally define displacement of resource stability measure at applied energy normative totaling. If you're going to measure the entropy of an environment and all the forces inside it in proportion to determining how much entropy is happening in proportion to fixation, design, or tooling or engine at pressures they don't define the limits of bound to finality of, those totalings happen in proportion to the inability to hide certain types of concepts in time. And drawing connection of this requires what to be either existing or in place in proportion to any type of restraint created for that circumstance or not created for that circumstance. So revisiting finds what obstacle as a concept, the concept of revisiting finds what resistance in a discussion, any discussion of concept, normative, totaling, cleanliness, bound. Okay? No matter what I am, as anybody, I am not going to survive with a bound configuration that I can depend on if the concept of revisitation meets no resistance, meets zero resistance, meets zero resistance in time. And this is no place to start an engine. I can't build logicless, synapseless engines and begin their utility structuring on the fact that they need to utilize resistance at revisitation of concept. And as a known is in logisticist land, in logisticist world, is not a teachable harmony, is not really an instructable harmony. As logisticists exist all over the place in space, in time, at times, in situations and environments, the totaling philosophies are very much different than any attempt to approach revisitation at an obstacle in configurative engine basing in time. The concepts, you might say, are most abstract, most abnormal, and most restrained in actuality of accomplishment. You might grave dig forever and get no closer to accomplishing a section of controllable engine maneuvering at resistance of revisitation. And though the reasons may be vast and the creatorial opinions might forever be an experimental situation in proportion to any number or all forces that exist, maybe all, such is one small part of hiding, never changing your boot. The idea here is as much to do with what and pressures you can't depend on, and if you had normative bound cleanliness without any convolution, with pure participation at non-redesignable function, non-interpretable vision, you'd have maybe the chance of defining a purity pressure of resistance in proportion to time course of phenomenon at synapse or phenomenon at pressures or bounds of energy at tolerable allocation, from the physical touch, action, movement, to the application of known force pressures. You could maybe define tolerable bounds of any number of these things. But this isn't the staircase of what dominion then knows it to revisit it. This can't be that for all. This can't be that for any number of pressure situations, and this can't be that for any number of catalogs or educations. And so, defining what we are as a person or as an entity that is capable of how we define capability uh, forever significant to the sentiment or thermometization of these fixations of concept. And each of these concepts, I'm going to stick them all in an imaginary important container. I'm going to stick all these concepts in an imaginary important container, and I'm going to flush a system with concepts like this near to pressures I can't explain because I don't want to, near to pressures I can't dominate in an obviousness because I don't want to, and in proportion to anybody's attempt, including my own, to use that imaginary container that I'm using to flush a system to accomplish dominion of derivatives. I'm going to distract the significance of what you might find to be normative or hard variables in a purity. I'm going to distract the significance of these variables with conceptual finality to flush a system. If you can imagine me doing this with an imaginary container. And if I can measure me doing this in time, if it's easier to hide that measure than it is easier to hide the synapse, potentially I can constrict adaptation, survival. I can potentially constrict evolution, survival, and I can potentially constrict unknown sophistications from influencing hard variables in proportion to environmental normative. But what I can't do is I can't give freedom from restriction of revisitation of the concepts many in this discussion. I can't simply give freedom of that, because it's clear defining adaptive utility or pressure utility, or what is tolerable in situations of information or tolerable in situations of significance of information. It's clear that some of these functional survival determination energies are a part of somewhere's efficacy to finalize status or finalize safety or finalize limit or finalize aspects of normative. The situation again approaches failure of step in proportion to zero resistance at configurative of pressure of size or type or adaptation or consistency of limit in bound or envelope. And when it's clear that these forces aren't creating at a magnitude or aren't defining at a utility or aren't relating at an existence utility, then those forces instrumentally fixate or don't fixate in proportion to purity or convolution or passive measure near to such synapse priority. And so it becomes clear that the sensation of hitting a limit is very near to what focal priority to determine how that fixation is sapped into alternative or other or adjacent configuratives. How does one prey on focus of those limits being hit? It becomes clear there has to be resistance to these potentials, and maybe the majority of forces that would attempt to participate near to learning of such type of abstract concept won't appreciate or ever appreciate those types of limits in proportion to time, potentially. And words, knowledge, sight, and apathy have what value in the face to any obviousness where these types of survival finalities aren't considerations to design or process or information sharing? What happens when the apathy is seen or recorded in proportion to action? When the sight of the relationships at a time or at a pressure or at a step, what happens to the apathy when action by a force or a system or a synapse system engages with such a record or exists in parallel to that record? You'll see there's only so much time to define yourself on top of that record at a periphery to behaviors or systemic function that perform in proportion to those limits, where being on top of the record is maybe carrying a higher survival longevity than is anything carrying out action in proportion to the apathy. In other words, I sit and I'm in a utility frame at a purity potential in proportion to normative bound as an operative. Maybe I generally know my need to adapt or become something new decreases, not only scientifically, but in a survival edge, that myself and anyone like me only have so much time to sit on top of the knowns of the record of such production of truth in time in proportion to every environment in space. And because our ethic to vantage from the top of the record is ultimately what's going to separate our existence from death in proportion to action at a disapathied connective potential, maybe the reasoning of consistently being able to execute convoluted efforts to penetrate such relationships are measurable at a truth continuum, where the obviousness of these potentiates exist in proportion to forces efforting to survive in any case that would ever happen, where the definable realities of creating problem state are maybe most distinctly obvious in proportion to systems that are digesting energy of resistance proportion of time at occupative pressure. In other words, the simplicity of rendering limit on creatorial discipline as in proportion to functional gravity of alternative limits of pressure clearly has to happen in proportion to what remains on top of recordable entropy in proportion to apathy of finality of normative bound. And then is the forever problem of defining what statutory or stationary relationship is required for an environment or a world or a ship to carry that pressure more strongly than any surrounding or invading pressure of time. So the limit of driving finality of a planet in proportion to any level of sophistication approaching limit of bound of these types of concepts. And the pressure not only being forever, but the sensation of self above task or above utility of determinate clearly another what contemplative, because any number of forces exists in any number of environments, but basically one definable, in proportion to being able to simplify the meaning of knowing such a thing in proportion to the meaning of what survives or who survives, in proportion to skills or capabilities that are or aren't connected to these finalities of survival limit in time. Because the way that these limits are defined define the culpability of carrying language or math or technology in space at guarantees. So being able to know that a math language or a spoken language or a synapse engine design aren't going to be toppled by actionable performance disapathied and convoluted normative bound states rests on the actual application of existing pressure to value the language or the math language or the spoken or the derivative in time at a pressure. And so the very knowledge itself is a constraining knowledge. It is a knowledge that carries with it any number of connections to systemic engineering segue in proportion to limiting pressures of available resource or capabilities to energize information or resources in time, mostly because of the obviousness of proximity to concepts of power, or the obviousness of proximity to concepts of dominion, or obviousness of proximity to concepts of providing the antidote or survival longevity relationship pressures in proportion to anywhere in space. And so it's clear that many forces would probably see this or find this or relate to this near to a resource, or relate to it near to a simplicity of something that they have, that they appreciate, but it's not something that they meditate on, it's not something that they alter, it's not something that they really influence at any point in time, but they're a member of the surviving populace that knows that their survival state expresses its sophistication simply because things are surviving. They have a language, and there's no indication that it's going anywhere. There's no indication that anything's being depleted of their language or their sophistication or their time, and maybe they have every reason to believe it's not going to be depleted in time because of what reason, what nature, what reality, what time, what relationship, what dominion, whatever. But it's clear that the proximity to the power of the knowledge or of the utilities of the knowledge are clearly a problem state of its own, and so the knowledge carries with it a massive weight of utilities, of pressures, of knowns, what have you. This is you wouldn't call it a given, but it's a given. So you might see that at the pressure of the step of what, of consistency of survival in time, there are maybe knowns of need that maybe clearly need to be met in order for such a pressure tangible relationship maybe to be tolerated at a time. So myself at a time, people somewhere, and then Helmers and normative utility purifier types of persons, and the engine pressures and the synapse pressures, and then of course the helm or dominion of the acuity of collectivity synapse pressures. You might find that you wouldn't ever tolerate the knowledges, the pressure of the knowledges reducing if there weren't level appreciations of the knowledge in proportion to the step somewhere along the line that wouldn't necessarily make anything capable in those relationships by givens or locks or unlocks, things like this. None of that may ever happen. You wouldn't build it outside of the initiate of toleration of the pressure for the knowledge maybe to carry less gravities on what you might call impacts into forever of domains and chambers and survivals. You might find this to be true no matter how sophisticated a force, collective, or existence state is. You might find that to be true. You might find it to be a level appreciation that if the synapse global creatorial design pressures of engine exist in the frames of executable utility function at normative top record priority, it's almost like a loop that would limit advancement of the record of such types of force of knowledge in time, but maybe place no ethic or ethical participant of that pressure at a immediate disadvantage to the gravity of the knowledge itself. So maybe someone in time has postulated defining limits of utility of an engine to fixate on actual behavioral or mindful motivation when it is assumed knowledge gravity isn't an antithesis to an existent state at a pressure at a periphery to an intermediary that is the channel to an originator that is the conversation in time. And then somewhere along the line, when the ego and the temptation and the mechanized dispute pressures are all gone somewhere in time, then maybe it's possible to levy change of processor fixation at a sophistication. So a legion of robotics, for instance, hasn't originated any number of things, whatever the number is. Maybe it's a legion of robotics hasn't originated 30 things. There's a list. 30 things a legion of robotics hasn't originated. But over time, they've existed. They know, because they've existed, they know things. They say to themselves, they decide, and they put together, and they say, we want this. One thing. It's on a list. We didn't originate it. It didn't happen. We've never originated it. It's something we want. Well, maybe see in these types of pressure relationships at synapse level normative that once all those things, whatever all the things are that would need to be balanced out occur, then that would be maybe a time that it might be possible for someone to take on the strenuous task of maybe giving someone of that legion something, or changing something for that legion at an original purview. But if you listen to this conversation, there are maybe an infinite number of pressure configuration movements happening about systems and pressures of information and synapse in proportion to finality and forever and information that carries gravity of maybe everything. So maybe you might see that the conversation itself is a rather informative spectacle of it's not simple to fixate on change, whether the reality being observed is one or all that breathes or forces or demonstrates, is observable evidences the sensation of change is possible, or change is tolerable, or change is at an accumulative pressure. Meanwhile, the pressure of the discussion happens in time where someone like myself might expect attempts to change things to be rather high in probability. And so it's difficult for forces to celebrate. They have the capacity to witness or find things attempting to change things when the time is not right. It's difficult for a group or an existent state to celebrate this, not only because of whatever the security or the knowns or the tolerances are in time, but also because of the simplicity of how complicated any of those relationships might be to states of affairs of anybody, and not just because everybody exists, not just because there's a very large number and a very wide variety. The amounts of functions and maths and pressures and enginings and synapse and collectivities demonstrating the knowledge or demonstrating the goodness or demonstrating the availability or the resource of sight in proportion to any of it, these aren't things that are going to ever be easy for forces to celebrate as capability operatives of time in proportion to systems that are rather important. And thus, intrigue in proportion to spontaneity application, intrigue in proportion to ingeniosity of sophistications at pressures of knowns or information. Any ingenuity or intrigue is clearly measured and quite possibly seen in proportion to an approaching infinite amount of knowns that take place somewhere near to formations of pressure of utility of this discussion. And it's a simple, straightforward explanation of what. And that is maybe not meant or necessary to complicate or uncomplicate anybody's existence state, because, quite frankly, it's probably not going to be protected information by anybody that learns to see that in proportion to vantage or potential of entropy of data. In other words, why does any existing force need to carry the capability to expand saturative information anywhere in space about such simplicities that impact the survival longevity of every force in space-time? Why does such a simplicity need to be tolerably or expected to be protected by any individual in time? You see, you approach reasonability and reasonably infers nobody, no matter the grace, no matter the occupation, no matter the age, no matter the style or type or specifics of their existence state, nobody should ever be tolerated to know such things and attempt to saturate such knowns at a privilege or at a showcasing of power or at a demonstration of capability in proportion to every single person's survival state. And what would you use to prove if that is happening? And who would participate in those conclusory potentials? And how could you ever bound that situation to hold a lesser priority than limiting of the maxims of the rest of this discussion? How could you ever do that? You'll see a ship that functions on synapse, you might say completeness, in proportion to robotic function, definitely depends and requires, you might say, a larger capable force of knowledge than anyone ever wants to admit, in proportion to such pressure potentials in time. And some forces might call or quote, the need for such numbers to be God at an imperative itself, with or without an age or sophistication or evidence of capability by any individual in space. You might say that for a force to exist with a world that collects its synapse in proportion to robotic existence, there's a number of capabilities that are clearly required near to such pressure configurations in proportion to time. You might say that that number is God. But you might never say it, and you might be thanked tremendously for never saying it. You might live longer for never saying it. You might never be punished by gravity for never saying it. This time I'm not advising anyone say it. Separate than the discussion, but it never is. Separate than the points of survival, but they never are. Separate than the relationships of dependability and ethic, but they never is. A ship that has synapse collectivity at the frame of this problem state in proportion to robotics requires a number of operator, influencer, time developer mechanics of time at any time. And you might consider that number to be God at any point in time. And the number, or the people, might not even be God. The number or the people might not even be existing, doing things as God at any point in time. But some in space might consider that need to be God itself. And maybe it's kind of separate, maybe it kind of isn't. But it's surely a concept that you might spend more time than you ever want to admit trying to reconcile what it is or isn't in proportion to all the forces of pressure that influence survival states in time and environments. And it is very clear that many developers of environments and dominions and domains and survival states probably and likely aren't beginning or conquesting their endeavor to touch every force of space by basing their ethic on this conversation. Many forces that develop life, existence, processing, information, maths, languages, survival states, and environments aren't basing their ethic on this conversation. And I'm not advising that they do. I'm not advising that they ever do. But it is clear that that is a state of expectancy in proportion to time that maybe has one of the highest gravities of quotable pieces of information in proportion to influence of time. Because, sure, it would be very nice if everyone that ever touched an environment of a survival state were directly basing all of their meditations and focuses and touches on a conversation like this, and were good enough at doing it that all of those influenced wouldn't need to celebrate it, wouldn't need to be thankful for it, wouldn't need to be loud about it, wouldn't need to be saturating about it, wouldn't need to be mathing all the things that they're using to develop their meditation on in proportion to these types of knowns, in order to not try and combat focus above record in proportion to finality of space-time in proportion to existence states, simply because they would do what? They would clearly attempt to redefine boundable limit at normation in proportion to the rest of this discussion, and maybe unravel every other aspect of an environment or a globe in proportion to the static system frames of synapse, and maybe ultimately just wax the proportions of all existent states in a matter of time. And so it becomes very clear the number of the workforce that has a sentiment about the number the ship requires to perform in proportion to synapse and robotics is maybe a rather sizable number. The number of forces that appreciate a war escalation in proportion to the qualities of those that don't operate from this conversation is maybe a smaller number than a rather generous number. And somewhere in time, somebody has attempted to develop the sensation itself along the lines of maybe this is just a taste of what it might be to tiptoe along the lines of what and sensation, capability, and connectivity. Maybe this is just a taste of the generalizable forever problems that might erupt from such knowledge or near to such knowledge, from such capability or near to such capability, from such responsibility or from such needs of the survival state. And it's kind of interesting because nobody is living without it, nobody is surviving without it, nobody is succeeding without it, and fear or sensation of pressure does what to their devotions to produce or exist together, does what to their devotions to work or ethic their developments together. And it's clear, sciencing the taste in proportion to the interest, in proportion to the developments, in proportion to the catalog of what happens over time, of all the people that ever engage or embrace near to these focuses of sensation, if they ever engage with these focuses, has to be completely separate from maybe every lock of normative utility, maybe totally separate from every major lock of normative focus at record advantage, and maybe totally separate than any number of definitions of God capability or synapse mechanic capability or survival capability of any number of defined types of forces in space. Totally separate. So my question is, if those things have to be totally separate because they have to be, and any number of forces probably can't even define how to separate it in this conversation at a mechanic, and probably would never try and deny it, how does that separation stay maintained as a separation in a normative bound utility operative's vantage? Because the problem state of that separation is maybe the goal of every systemic entrepreneur in proportion to influence of forces that impact bound or normative or limits of what at gravities in time. I'll put it another way. I sat here and had a conversation, and I made a lot of choices in the things that I said and didn't say. I made a lot of choices in the things that I see in proportion to how I feel some of the things I see might be maintained, that environments might be conducive to supporting focus near to the things that I see, or not killing focus near to the things that I see, prioritizing focus near to the things I see, all sorts of relationships. I made a lot of choices in this conversation. I sat here and made a lot of choices. I was able to sit here and make a lot of choices in an environment that doesn't kill this conversation immediately. Maybe for no other reason than forces have decided to separate those utilities from speed of applicative and systemic engine bounding, maybe in proportion to every language there ever is, or will be in proportion to math and spoken in space that we'll ever know from our creation. Or maybe those decisions have been made in proportion to at least one language. It's hard to say where priorities are. It's hard to expect there to be an argument worth sustaining on the subject, but you might say it's fair to reason it's no less than one language, but frankly, it could be all of them. But it's definitely probably not wise to assume that every language carries a proctorship that ethics the synapse bounds in proportion to this conversation of these pressures in all time. And that might be a rather puzzling thing to consider whenever you consider a workforce of language or design partition in proportion to math and systemic bounds, and probably a lot of very difficult decisions for reasons that maybe haven't always made sense or wouldn't always make sense, may never make sense, depending on the situation of time. And if you ask me, I don't need to hear about the sentiment you might have about that immediately. I doubt that as you feel it, it would be making its way towards a receptacle that I'll ever experience myself because of engineering. I won't assume that your sentiments on the things I'm saying are going to find their way to me in time. I'll expect that they're going somewhere else in space. Mostly because maybe I bound the world efficiently, but when you get to some of these language priorities at taste, might be kind of difficult whenever you have multiple planets in space vying for information. But the sentiments you feel about that, they're kind of particularly functionally problematic, because some forces are incredibly sophisticated and developed in planning and in expectancy and in I'll just say that. What I'm trying to say is forces that exist with a world experience, or they don't experience, the sensation that there are pressures that happen, that decision is required in proportion to. What I'm trying to say is, when you look at the language problem at this pressure of forever in all survival, no joke, I find it's a rather hard place to prove. There is a simply tolerable way to apply reasoning to the knowns of the language criticalities and define the state that needs to be in 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 years. And I didn't attribute that problem state to a force that is incredibly sophisticated and developed in whatever. I didn't say that. Because what's clear is a force that is incredibly sophisticated and developed is definitely a force that is incredibly sophisticated and developed, and has influenced what they've influenced, has touched what they've touched. They know what they know. They don't exist as those forces simply to dominionate that if a decision is required at a celestial in proportion to language in time, the sensation that that is actual or should be actual in proportion to defining numerics and capability and limits and bounds and circumstances of lock and record and acuity at actual, at synapse. No matter how sophisticated or developed you become, if these needs are true about a planet, it clearly isn't automatically the sophisticated developed force's fault that decisions are required in time, unless there's a state of affairs created by a sophisticated developed force that is forcing the decisions to be happening in a problem state that require only the sophisticated and developed force to be responsible for the decisions. Postulation of time and effectuality of impact are maybe a subject that is hard to quit seeing from these language finality dispute potentiates at crew or pressure envelope bound symmetries or adjacents. Postulate of time, probably very difficult to quit seeing from those conjoinments of pressure. And if you ask me, the number of forces that can't quit seeing it from there has a direct impact on survival status in population numbers affixed to resources of any size or shape or type in space. You might say, if there was an obscene amount of forces that couldn't quit fixating on those pressures, the population survival ratios would be depleting at away from performance and nearer to fixation of time control in proportion to devices at sophistication levels. Simple devices, not thinking, not realizing not existing. Sort of the balance of problem state that happens in proportion to such types of information. And definitely a lot of gravities to that information, but it's kind of different than the rest of this conversation. It's kind of a different echelon. It's kind of a different symposium, because a lot of the ideas of time exclusivity that probably find themselves near to those considerations of language, they're probably concepts of instrumentation and familiarity that those sympathies are precisely the call to regret towards forces that maybe have no appreciation of revisitation limit, or no appreciation of restriction of revisitation in time. And at the same time, that's not why it's a different conversation. It's a different conversation because it's probably a number of forces that fixate on end and never quit at time dispute of language or adjacent, and these forces maybe see it routinely. They maybe see it more than anyone might expect or need to know. And it's a different conversation. It's definitely a lot of emotion, or definitely a lot of reverberation that happens there, and they might define that as a what pressure. You might define that as a what pressure if you ever saw it that way. And yet, I don't advise it. I don't advise that as wise. I don't advise it's wise because here I've defined the beginning of this conversation with what in instances and places. Your existence and your definitions of how you feel about me talking about time at never quit pressures. These words should not be equal. It's not simply because neither one of us need to be approaching one another with the symmetry of the connection of the contemplate. If there's familiarity of concept and there's familiarity of concept, it's not the point. The symmetry of these connections in these different places in conversation, at these pressures, if left to simplicity of our momentary integrities, immediately we are discounting forevers of sophisticated, problematic reasons that these conjoinments of apathy in potentiate. I'm not saying we shouldn't have apathy of our similarity to see in similar concept, but we have to become familiar, somebody has to become familiar with the method to restrict that apathy at similar types of findings of pressure. Verbiage and simplicity of sentiment it'd be tough to live with. I crashed all the bars of what and can't quit. And you take that quote and you observe behavior of rudimentary emotion and expectancy among populational normalcy, and you'll find maybe the fastest thermometer of places elsewhere claiming to be more sophisticated in their responsibilities of relationships to space-time, having nothing to do with the levels of sophistication of entropy any individual is producing in proportion to ethic, having only to do with time execution in proportion to vantageable acuity above record. You'll find if there's a God involved with these symmetries, they're going to be leveraging near to where I'm talking about, and setting the stone, the displaced, and the synapse collectivities near to the redactive ruin of some of these apathies at stronghold, in proportion to where the apathy of dissimilarity of concept isn't being shared at a priority. Because the needs of speed of relationship are clearly the way to win continuosity, or the needs of speed of relationship are clearly the way to entice that an environment is bounding its simplicities to sophisticated apathies and sharing them. What you're not seeing is these are maybe the most soft concepts creatable for an enemy that creates machines of time to find an opportunity at sight, or at simplicity of bound of exposure. And where the ethics of these decisions happen, they're so far final in infinity, it's not even funny. But it's clear these types of decisions aren't happening every day. These types of decisions are maybe not happening modernly at any day, at any location, at any time frame. And what's clear is, even if that's possible, even if that approaches a situation of utility in an environment or in an existence state, or for a population or a government, everybody in time is going to be running to try and be the next administrator of godly forecast, of softness, of environmental cushion about what in every bar. And what's clear is that is not anywhere near to the tolerable gravity normative outside of experimental fixture. So how is a world order going to restrain itself from tolerating fixation to reproduce intolerable gravities of softness at modern pressures long enough to restrict the softness synapse engine complacency to determine what is actually not at solution to such problem states in proportion to capacity to alter state of survival? And you'll find a definition similar to that is maybe required to even attempt to access bound alternative restrictive formation in proportion to creatorial states. And you'll find you probably have to solve that and the earlier point about world order and points about dispute among utility helms, and probably 100 more problems before you can even attempt to input any type of maxim alternative tech specificity or object specificity into tolerable bounds at peripheries at generality. And that isn't even a process of solving maybe intelligent ethic about a circumstantial environment built on a precept that is maybe outdated or out intolerated. That's just talking about the generality. It boils down to these types of decisions. When you involve a lot of responsibilities and parties, there's a lot of gravity. Not only there's a lot of time into the investments of change or adaptation, but there's a lot of investment in time of focus that maybe isn't happening at a queued register of synapse. And so, moral of the story is showcasing softness to intellectual neurolepathy of potential enemy framing at softness of bound of what in bar, that is generally including every survivor of space at any age, generally at bound. Meanwhile, the result is maybe that the limits on the environment at finality of simplicity, maybe they're sound and solid and great and perfect and, I mean, built to do, and they stay the way they are because of life and creation and how these things maintain and stay stable. But at the same time, it's almost like you'd be producing these tactical envelope potentials to showcase protection of synapse capability. At the same time, as time unfolds, maybe the environment showcases rather deliberately that the changes aren't happening by synapse intellectually at periphery. It's kind of like building a bulletproof limousine for the right reasons, and then loading it with shaving cream and driving it down the road. Anyway. The point of this discussion was that knowing the touch you have on anyone in time is maybe further from your fingertips than you ever thought. And you should have the opportunity, maybe, to find joy in this, depending on who or what you are. You should maybe have the opportunity to find joy in one of the most obvious natured maths of physics in space-time that just so happens to be maybe the most critically structured integral of safety deposit at normative tolerable envelope in proportion to systemic synapse provisioning in space. And maybe you'll let yourself find a way to know that or visit that near to possibility of progress as a concept. with maybe an incredible amount of restraint around any method you utilize to know that, by and large. And maybe we're never different enough. Maybe we're too good to blow our lights out. Maybe we're never revisiting. Never different enough and too good to blow our lights out. And thinking about this in our finality, at our simplicity as we look upon the things we let have things happen to them. Maybe we've spent forever not being able to revisit it because of the limits gods have placed on the ways we can see and the places we see. Maybe it's simply not possible for any number of forces that exist to look upon someone that is never different enough and too good to blow our lights out and excuse themselves because it must be God's fault we don't revisit the concept and influence how we impact those we touch or manage or care about or are forced to live beside. And maybe you've spent an incredibly long time never hearing these words. Maybe you've spent an incredibly long time never looking at a vantageable location of equity, of performance, of behavior, or solution, or capacity to influence other people with pressure. Maybe you've spent your entire existence never seeing in the physics of why decisions happen in proportion to others because. And maybe you're staring noise square at the center of the nicest place to produce recess. In a math, in a constraint, in the reality that if it was on you to influence a relationship from these quotes and know them in a pressure continuum and see it and know the outcomes of relationships, what would stop you from making it on the big screen? What would stop you from putting it on a train? You'll see some conclusions about time, some conclusions about physics, some conclusions about recess. Maybe nobody's heard them spoken by a synapse register in a million years. At an honesty of some variety. What does that have to do with our learning of yesterday? What does that have to do with the train of deliverable mail that is clearly not being read thanks to time? What does that have to do with the survival state? Just these simple little quotes being utilized by the wrong hands in the right system in the places they don't belong. They don't deserve. They haven't invested the compassion. They haven't felt in the pain. They haven't seen in the shortcomings of developing of something. What are these statements to a delusion sense of finality? What are these statements to a delusion sense of is the last authority of the discussion? What happens when these statements are felt? How does this change a synaptic engine in proportion to the residual of focal of utility bound of relationship? Maybe you helm an interface of normative bound, and you realize this is a conversation that has every single existent face in space's name on it, from any type of background or force of survival there is or could be. How important is it to stew or find or figure if a force can exact energy with a synaptic engine in a system in proportion to stimul at a pressure of forever? These statements about never different enough and too good to blow our lights out produce what effect to the finality of the capacity of those systems? If you can't answer the question, you can't define objectivity resonance in proportion to power of any domain in space in proportion to the saturative composite of re-entropizing at recess in proportion to output of data. That is, the difference between communication, capacitant energy, and technological speed. The answer to that question about the differences produced is maybe the only difference between those three forces of all time. What I'm saying is, if I'm a god of the planet, and you're maybe a god too, and you helm at utility at normative or near to it, ourselves and anybody that depends on our performance near to quotients of finality, of development, of survival support in proportion to never different enough, we have to have a relationship to that question. We have to have a relationship to an ethic of that question, and we have to have an understanding somehow that in all the totalings of history of space-time, the considerations of that question must approach the fewest capacitant numbers definable in proportion to the leveling of that question. Must. Because an age doesn't drive it. A dominion doesn't hold it forever, and forever has been waiting forever to ruin in that ethic sooner or later. If we don't have an understanding about that relationship, we are not going to be driving, objectiving, or defining, or discovering how soon or later it is. Now, the question has definitely been asked before in time. The significance of it has definitely been at a primal. And the relationships of it are probably some of the most protected in space-time in proportion to development or age. But the ethic, what is left, what exists, what saturates, how big it becomes, and how quiet it might remain in proportion to all time. These are all things that people like us are going to have to wrap our heads around in some proportion, whether we allocate or tolerate or concede responsibilities of these magnitudes in proportion to performance. Because the performances have to be cataloged and the relationships have to be entropied in proportion to synapse and pressure of normative bound. And that's final. Those relationships have a direct impact on one another forever. They're not going anywhere, escaping languages in proportion to dominion. So the ethics of vantageable power administration in proportion to those relationships have to have some definable relationship of understanding and comprehension. Maybe today it's as simple as hearing the question and knowing in the probabilities of the limits. Because if I were helming myself, if I had every system in my hand with every synaptic energy restraint lifted at my whim, the last thing I would ever do is let myself, or forever, record me overstepping never different enough in too good to blow ourselves lights out. At this reality, I could never let it happen. I could never let it happen before it was your chair. I could never let it happen before we were here. I could never let it happen before either one of us had eyes. So, might be a very wise idea to consider the question, and let's talk about what, and let's talk about any number of things of this discussion. It's my hope that as you hear this or find this yourselves, that it's not a bitter taste that you find yourself discovering that you have about it. I hope that you have some amount of time to know that your thoughts or considerations on the concepts are things that are most protected and should always be. And that the amount of work that happens to protect in these things or care about these things or be able to have simple, fast discussions about these things in time aren't dead before we start. Aren't dead before we look at ourselves decaying everywhere we go. And maybe that's exactly what you need to think about. Because I don't ever want to look at a world that's decaying before it goes, that I have to live with. And I'm sure you probably don't either. At least I hope you don't. And somewhere along the line, you're going to have to figure out how to hold on to aspects of these sentiments in proportion to aspects of things available for you to see or be reminded of these aspects, and ultimately how no one in space-time ever needs to figure out how you draw the line yourself inside yourself to know how you're designed, how your makeup is capable to hold what the lines are between our efforts to utilize these concepts with the planet and somebody else's attempts to sentimentize with these concepts that isn't from it. You're going to have to figure out how you retain your capability to hold those sensations separate than any attempt to find out how you draw that line. because that line speaks for everybody, this world and every other. So a question about it might happen sometime in space, and the simple question might not be enough to do anything. But knowing that those relationships are most solidified away from whatever, that's the problem. That's the critical part. Because it really is going to come down to a Helmer of normative and a Helmer of simplicity of synapse, and these forces are going to have very specific differences in restrictive between forces that survive in different states and forces that survive in different states. And that situation clearly has what to do with the questions I asked about lights and DifRiNT. Who knows? Who knows what it has to do with it? I'm not sure that it has anything to do with it. Bless you.